Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. On today's video, what I want to do is to discuss a recent video out by Religion for Breakfast, which is a wonderful YouTube channel that discusses all kinds of topics in religion, hosted by Andrew Henry, who is a scholar of early Christianity. They're doing a recent series on Buddhism, and I watched one of the episodes, which is an episode on who is the Buddha, and wanted to make some comments about it. Now, this is a video, since Andrew Henry is himself not an expert on Buddhism, these videos on Buddhism are being scripted by Kate Hartmann, who is a scholar of Buddhist studies, a professor of Buddhist studies, whose expertise is in Tibetan Buddhism. Just to start out, the video is very good. It's a very good introduction to the Buddha, from both a historical and a mythological context, which I think is very apt for this kind of introductory video. They could have left the question of the historical Buddha entirely to one side, as some accounts of the Buddha as a person do, but they opted to discuss some of the historical account of the Buddha's life, which I think is all to the good. And it'll be that historical account that'll be mostly what I'll be dealing with in this video. So there are a couple of points that I want to make. Now, both of them are, in the scheme of things, relatively minor points. The first of them is a minor point which, is basically a kind of a nit that I want to pick because of some videos I've done recently. The other is a relatively minor point, but that I think points to a deeper issue, a larger and deeper issue that really doesn't have to do specifically with this video, but is a point sort of in the background of this video, shall we say. So to begin with, the first relatively minor point has to do with the meaning of the word Buddha. What does Buddha mean?
To start to understand who the Buddha is, let's start with the word itself, Buddha. Literally, the term Buddha comes from the Sanskrit root bud, which means to wake up. So the term Buddha literally means the awakened one.
Now, I hardly expect Kate or Mark to have watched my recent videos on this topic, but the question about what Buddha means is significantly more nuanced than Mark and Kate led on in this video. It is true that in Vedic Sanskrit, which is a language that was about 1,000 years before the Buddha's lifetime, Bud did mean waking up, to wake up. However, during the Buddha's lifetime, that word seems to have changed its connotation quite a bit, so that at the time of the Buddha, it meant something more along the lines of knowing or understanding. And it's this sort of point, as well as others, that leads the eminent scholar and translator Bhikkhu Bodhi, who has translated many of the early Pali texts into English, to argue that awakened one is really not the proper translation, and rather we should use the term enlightened one. Now, Andrew, Kate go on to say,
so to return to the title, Buddha, the awakened one, he is the one who has woken up to see the nature of reality, while all other beings stumble through samsara in a dreamlike, ignorant state.
Now, in the early texts, in fact, ordinary people are never described as sort of sleepwalking or sleeping in their ordinary life, and the Buddha himself is never described as somebody literally waking up from sleep, or the metaphor is never used of the Buddha that he is somebody who has woken up from sleep. And this is indeed one of the, probably I would say, the central argument that leads Bhikkhu Bodhi to argue that awakened one is probably not the proper translation of Buddha. Both Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Analayo have written very recent papers on this issue. I don't expect Kate Hartmann to be familiar with them, but nevertheless they're out there. And to be fair, Bhikkhu Analayo does believe that awakened one is the proper translation, but the point here that I'm trying to make is that there is a controversy within two of the most eminent scholars and translators of this early tradition alive today, and so we might at least want to take account of that. So anyway, that's a relatively minor point. Another point, the second point that I want to make, has to do with something that Kate and Mark say later on in the video. Basically, what they're saying, the context of this point that they're making is that the early texts, that there are early texts in the Buddhist canon. The early texts in Pali are perhaps the earliest, although, to be fair, there are also recensions of these, translations of these texts into Chinese and into other Indic languages. And a lot of, well, what scholarship there is on the early texts right now, a lot of it is scholarship around comparisons between these various recensions to try to find out how far back we can take these texts and which ones we think are more credible as revealing something about the early history of Buddhism and which ones are less credible. In any event, when discussing these early texts and what they reveal about the Buddha's life, Kate and Andrew say,
these texts were said to have been memorized by the Buddha's followers after his death and then written down around the 1st century BCE, so hundreds of years after the Buddha's life. But scholars maintain that a significant portion of the material dates back at least to the 3rd century BCE. So what do they say about the Buddha's life? Well, unfortunately not much. Interestingly, in these early texts, the Buddha only makes the most vague references to his past and doesn't ever give the full story of his birth and early life.
Now, this just isn't so. There is a lot of information about the Buddha's life in these Pali texts, in these early texts, and again in their recensions in other languages. A lot of evidence, a lot of material on the life of the Buddha even before he became enlightened. Now, to be fair, Kate and Andrew do mention a very key text in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta in the video, a text that I've mentioned myself a number of times, a very, very important piece of information about the Buddha's early life. However, it's hardly the only piece of information we have on the Buddha's life in the early Pali canonical material. In particular, there is an early text that discusses the Buddha's life, his delicate lifestyle when he was growing up in his father's house. His father's house appears to have been, or actually a series of houses, appears to have been something of a palace. And he describes that lifestyle in some detail. For example, he says, "My lifestyle was delicate, mendicants, most delicate, extremely delicate. In my father's home, lotus ponds were made just for me. In some, blue water lilies blossomed, while in others they were pink or white lotuses just for my benefit. I only used sandalwood from Kasi, and my turbans, jackets, sarongs, and upper robes also came from Kasi." And it goes on in that kind of vein, in some detail. The Buddha then goes on to talk about how in that palatial lifestyle, he nevertheless spent time reflecting on old age, sickness, and death, and how all people, all beings were going to befall these kinds of fates. Now, as we might expect, Kate and Mark go on to discuss the traditional 4 sights that Gautama is said to have had before he decided to leave the palace. I think many of us may be familiar with the mythological story of the Buddha, or the Buddha-to-be, Gautama, locked in the palace and leaving in the dead of the night, or at some point anyway, with, in secret with a guide of his, and then seeing an old man, a sick man, a dead person, and a monastic. And these 4 sights leading the Buddha to decide to leave home. There's no account like this in the early texts. The closest account that I've found, or that exists that I know of, is the one that I've just pointed to, this text where the Buddha discusses his thoughts about old age, illness, and death. However, there is an account in an early sutta that discusses a different Buddha, a Buddha from a much earlier time called Vipassi, who is said to have undergone essentially the same 4 sights, and before he became enlightened. This is in the Mahabodhana Sutta, and seems at least potentially to indicate that there was a conflation of the Buddha Gautama's story with this Buddha Vipassi's story, that these stories became conflated at a later date. And I discussed a lot of this in an earlier video of mine on the Buddha's supposed 4 sights, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes in case you want to see it. Other suttas on the Buddha's early life discuss, of course, many of us will know, they discuss his time learning meditation techniques from his first two meditation teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. They also discuss his various attempts with austerities of various kinds that he decided were not particularly beneficial. These are stories that many of us will be familiar with. However, there are other texts that people may be less familiar with that, for example, discuss the Buddha in his early life retreating into the forest to meditate and having to deal with the fear and terror that would arise in him when he was alone in the forest at night. It's not clear if this happened during his time after leaving home, or whether he would go into the forest at night while he was perhaps even in the palace. Perhaps he was at home with in his father's house and would go out at night for meditation. It's not clear. Another early sutta discusses how the Buddha became aware of having two kinds of thought. That there were certain thoughts that he would have that he realized were skillful thoughts that were helpful to him and that would lead him in the right direction. And there were other thoughts that he would have that were unskillful, that were leading him in the direction of harm and other bad states. And it was this awareness of this distinction between these two kinds of thoughts that led him towards practice. In other words, it led him towards a lifestyle of attempting to bolster the thoughts that were beneficial to him while removing the strength of the thoughts that were less beneficial. And there are many, many suttas in this vein that discuss various aspects of what the Buddha used to think about before he became enlightened. And then, of course, there is a vast amount of material in these Pali canonical texts about the Buddha's later life, about his life during his teaching career, about what he taught, about how he interacted with monastics, about how he would argue with and disagree with certain of his competitors at the time, the discussions, the disagreements he would have with them, why they would disagree, how they would disagree, about his own pains and sufferings at various times, even after he was enlightened, that he would have back pain and would have to, at times, retire and lie down and have somebody else give a Dharma talk for him, about his sickness later on in life, about his impending death and then eventually his death. There's an enormous amount of information on the Buddha's life in these early canonical texts. Now in the video, Andrew and Kate rely upon a much later text, the 5th century of the Common Era text called the Nidana Katta. Now, to be fair, this text, although it was probably composed around the 5th century of the Common Era, is sourced from much earlier material. It is also a text which gives a relatively complete and simple introduction to the Buddha's life. In other words, it's a text where you can go to one place and find a lot of information laying out for you in a kind of a linear sequence. However, it's hardly the first place you'd want to go if you were looking for a historical account of Gautama, the Buddha's life. After all, it stems from 1,000 years later than the actual life itself, or nearly 1,000 years anyhow. And I think instead of going to a text like that right away, a historical account can start earlier. And indeed, many of the points that Kate and Andrew make in the video that were apparently taken from the Nidana Katta actually appear in the early canonical texts themselves, and so these early texts probably were the source of the Nidana's viewpoints on these issues. To take one example, Kate and Andrew look to the Nidana Katta to describe the Buddha's birth story. And it's true, there is a lot of information about the Buddha's birth in the Nidana Katta, but some of that comes from an early text called the Acharya Bhutta Sutta, which is in the Pali canonical material much earlier. It's probably at least in part, a hagiographical text, so it's probably not one of the earliest texts in the Pali canon. Nevertheless, it exists there and describes the Buddha's birth, and describes the Buddha as having taken 7 steps after he was born. It describes the Buddha having uttered some statements. In other words, he was able not only to walk, but to speak after he was born. Now, there are a number of historical oddities about these texts that scholars have noted. Bhikkhu Analayo has written quite a bit of information on them, in particular at length in his treatise on the origins of the Bodhisattva ideal. He talks about this text in some detail and talks about how, again, probably a lot of it is somewhat later. It's not some of the earliest material. There's some of the accounts in the Acharya Bhutta Sutta that are not, that we do not find in all of its other recensions, its other copies, so maybe slightly later. There's a bunch of issues with it. My point simply is that we don't need to go to a 5th century of the Common Era text like the Nidana Katta. We can look earlier at earlier texts and find some of that information already there. Okay, so what's the basic point I'm trying to make here? Do I expect either Andrew or Kate Hartmann to have explained all of these sort of small nitpicking details in their introductory video on who is the Buddha? Of course not. I mean, there's no way they could go into all of this, and in fact, you really wouldn't want to. So again, I'm not really, my point here isn't so much about the video they produced, except for a couple of sentences, but it's rather a larger point, which is that a number of times when I have seen videos about the Buddha's life, the who is the Buddha kind of videos, and we'll bracket this particular video here a bit, but other videos I've seen will at times leave the question of the historical Buddha entirely to one side. They won't even discuss the historical Buddha, they'll discuss the mythological Buddha almost exclusively. Or even when we do have a video about the Buddha's life from a historical context, the video doesn't seem to be aware, the people who made the video don't seem, at least, apparently, to be aware of the actual evidence we have for historical Buddha in the early canonical texts. In other words, textual information is either not mentioned or left aside, not dealt with, and so we're left in something of a question. Now, I raised some of these questions in a Twitter thread that I posted a while back, and I got a very, very kind reply from Kate Hartmann in some detail. And she pointed out something that, in fact, I had been familiar with, which is that in Buddhist studies in general, there had been something of a pushback against a historical treatment of the Buddha. That earlier attempts at, shall we say, Buddhist studies had been more interested in the historical questions. However, when those questions came up, they got all tied into issues of purity of Buddhist practice. In other words, that the people who were discussing early Buddhism, these discussions got intermingled with questions as to who was practicing pure Buddhism. And these also got derailed into discussions of that current practitioners sort of quote-unquote weren't doing it right, that they were somehow practicing Buddhism incorrectly because they weren't doing it in a line with the way early Buddhism apparently was practiced given the information we have from the early texts. Now, I myself have tried to push back on this kind of narrative in my videos. I have an earlier video on the question of, what is correct Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes. I don't think that this is a proper, that using history in this way is a proper way of using it. There are many different approaches to Buddhism. We don't have to, and indeed we shouldn't, assume that early Buddhism is somehow correct in a way that later Buddhism isn't. However, it's also equally true that we shouldn't say that early Buddhism is incorrect. It simply is one option among many. And indeed, some few practitioners anyway today do practice what they consider early Buddhism, such as Bhikkhu Sujato, to an extent, to my knowledge, Bhikkhu Analayo. These are scholar practitioners who are actually interested in early Buddhism because it's what interests them as a practice. But that's not to say that everyone should follow that ideal, and I don't think either, to my knowledge, Analayo or Sujato would ever argue such a thing. But in any event, I questioned Kate Hartmann about this on the Twitter thread and asked her, how many scholars in the United States or elsewhere are really investigating early Buddhism, investigating the early texts as a historical, a source of history about early Buddhism. And she didn't come up with any names, and indeed I don't know of anybody either within the academy at the moment. It seems to me that the academic study of early Buddhism is essentially moribund. There are, of course, people such as Bhikkhu Analayo, such as Bhikkhu Sujato, such as Bhikkhu Bodhi, but none of these are academic scholars in the sense that none of them belongs to an academy at the moment. Bhikkhu Analayo used to, but now he's at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, which is not an accredited academy. So the problem here, to my way of seeing it, is that is not that there is some small group or steady group of scholars who are studying the material, but some of them may be saying things that we don't agree with, but rather that nobody is really studying this material, at least at an academic level. And this, I think, is a problem, because it leads to issues like the one we found with this particular video, which is that a scholar and a very able presenter end up saying that the early Buddhist texts say very little to nothing about the Buddha's life, which just isn't true. But if people end up believing such a thing, that the early Buddhist texts say nothing important about the Buddha's early life, or nothing much anyhow, that might lead us to simply ignore such texts, to leave them on the sidelines, to think we don't need to know them, we don't need to study them, we don't need to worry about them, because there's nothing really there that can inform us, and nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that much of the information that I bring across to you all in my videos comes from scholarship. I come up with ideas because I'll read a recent paper by somebody like Bhikkhu Analayo, somebody like Bhikkhu Bodhi, somebody like Rupert Gethin, who was one of the very, very few scholars who was working with this early material. And if there's no scholarship coming out, there's going to be very little for me to discuss, except for stuff that was published maybe 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. That would be, I think, a very sad state of affairs. Now, I don't, of course, want to place all of this, or even much of it, on the shoulders of Andrew or Kate, because, as I say, their video was very good in the main. It's a very good introduction, and I think certainly Kate seems to be aware of the issues here, and I'm sure that, both of them are doing all they can. Kate's study clearly is on Tibetan Buddhism, which is a much later kind of phenomenon in Buddhism, so that's not, this material isn't really her bread and butter, but that's fine. It's not for everybody. However, I will say that another approach to the question of who is the Buddha is to take it from a slightly more historical angle. And I've done several earlier videos on this question. I'll leave one up here on the screen of who is the Buddha, who was the Buddha. And if you're interested in a sort of a more generally historical take a look and see if you find anything interesting there. If you like these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page as well. It's linked down below. Thanks so much to Kate and to Mark for humoring me in this. Again, I enjoyed their video a lot, even with the little nitpicks I had. And we'll catch you on the next one. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.